Chapter 64, The Mystery Unfolded, Another Recognition, which, it is to be hoped, the reader could not foresee. The French lady then explained the whole mystery of Monimia's death, as a stratagem she had concerted with the clergyman and doctor, in order to defeat the pernicious designs of Fathom, who seemed determined to support his false pretensions by dint of perjury and fraud, which they would have found it very difficult to elude. She observed that the physician had actually despaired of Monimia's life, and it was not till after she herself was made acquainted with the prognostic, that she wrote the letter to Rinaldo, which she committed to the care of Madame Clement, with an earnest entreaty, that it should not be sent till after her decease. But that lady, believing the Count had been certainly abused by his treacherous confidant, dispatched the billet without the knowledge of Monimia, whose health was restored by the indefatigable care of the physician, and the sage exhortations of the clergyman, by which she was reconciled to life. In a word, the villainy of Fathom had inspired her with some faint hope that Rinaldo might still be innocent, and that notion contributed not a little to her cure. The letter having so effectually answered their warmest hopes, in bringing back Rinaldo such a pattern of constancy and love, the confederates, in consequence of his enthusiastic sorrow, had planned this meeting, as the most interesting way of restoring two virtuous lovers to the arms of each other, for which purpose the good clergyman had pitched upon his own church, and indulged them with the use of the vestry, in which they now were presented with a small but elegant collation. Melville heard this succinct detail with equal joy and admiration. He poured forth the dictates of his gratitude to the preservers of his happiness. "This church," said he, "shall henceforth possess a double share of my veneration. This holy man will, I hope, finish the charitable work he has begun, by tying those bands of our happiness, which naught but death shall have power to unbind." Then turning to that object which was the star of his regard, "Do I not overrate," said he, "my interest with the fair Monimia?" She made no verbal reply, but answered by an emphatic glance, more eloquent than all the power of rhetoric and speech. This language, which is universal in the world of love, he perfectly well understood, and, in token of that faculty, sealed the assent which she had smiled, with a kiss imprinted on her polished forehead. In order to dissipate these interesting ideas, which, by being too long indulged, might have endangered his reason, Madame Clement entreated him to entertain the company with a detail of what had happened to him in his last journey to the Empire, and Monimia expressed a desire of knowing, in particular, the issue of his contest with Count Trebesi, who, she knew, had usurped the succession of his father. Thus solicited, he could not refuse to gratify their curiosity and concern. He explained his obligations to the benevolent Jew, related the steps he had taken at Vienna for the recovery of his inheritance, informed them of his happy rencontre with his father-in-law, of his sister's deliverance and marriage, of the danger into which his life had been precipitated by the news of Monimia's death, and, lastly, of his adventure with the banditti, in favor of a gentleman, who, he afterwards understood, had been robbed in the most base and barbarous manner by Fathom. He likewise, to the astonishment of all present, and of his mistress in particular, communicated some circumstances, which shall appear in due season. Monimia's tender frame being quite fatigued with the scene she had acted, and her mind overwhelmed with the prosperous tidings she had heard, after having joined the congratulations of the company, on the good fortune of her Rinaldo, begged leave to retire, that she might by repose recruit her exhausted spirits, and the night being pretty far spent, she was conducted by her lover to Madame Clement's coach, that stood in waiting, in which also the rest of the company made shift to embark, and were carried to the house of that good lady, where, after they were invited to dine, and Melville entreated to bring Don Diego and the Jew along with them, they took leave of one another, and retired to their respective lodgings in a transport of joy and satisfaction. As for Rinaldo, his rapture was still mixed with apprehension, that all he had seen and heard was no more than an unsubstantial vision, raised by some gay delirium of a disordered imagination. While his breast underwent those violent, though blissful emotions of joy and admiration, his friend the Castilian spent the night in ruminating over his own calamities, and in a serious and severe review of his own conduct. He compared his own behavior with that of the young Hungarian, and found himself so light in the scale, that he smote his breast with violence, exclaiming in an agony of remorse, "Count Melville has reason to grieve, Don Diego to despair. His misfortunes flow from the villainy of mankind, mine are the fruit of my own madness. He laments the loss of a mistress, who fell a sacrifice to the perfidious arts of a crafty traitor. She was beautiful, virtuous, accomplished, and affectionate, he was fraught with sensibility and love. Doubtless his heart must have deeply suffered, his behavior denotes the keenness of his woe, his eyes are ever-flowing fountains of tears, his bosom the habitation of sighs, 500 leagues hath he measured in a pilgrimage to her tomb, nightly he visits the dreary vault where she now lies at rest, her solitary grave is his couch, he converses with darkness and the dead, until each lonely aisle re-echoes his distress. What would be his penance, had he my cause? Were he conscious of having murdered a beloved wife and darling daughter? Ah wretch, ah cruel homicide, what had those dear victims done to merit such a fate? Were they not ever gentle and obedient, ever aiming to give thee satisfaction and delight? Say, that Seraphina was enamored of a peasant, say, that she had degenerated from the honor of her race. The inclinations are involuntary, perhaps that stranger was her equal in pedigree and worth. Had they been fairly questioned, they might have justified, at least excused, that conduct which appeared so criminal, or had they owned the offense, and supplicated pardon, O barbarous monster that I am. Was all the husband, was all the father extinguished in my heart? How shall my own errors be forgiven, if I refuse to pardon the frailties of my own blood, of those who are most dear to my affection? Yet nature pleaded strongly in their behalf, my heart was bursting while I dismissed them to the shades of death. I was maddened with revenge. I was guided by that savage principle which falsely we call honor. Accursed phantom! That assumes the specious title, and misleads our wretched nation. Is it then honorable to skulk like an assassin, and plunge the secret dagger in the heart of some unhappy man, who hath incurred my groundless jealousy or suspicion, without indulging him with that opportunity which the worst criminal enjoys? Or is it honorable to poison two defenseless women, a tender wife, an amiable daughter, whom even a frown would almost have destroyed? Oh! This is cowardice, brutality, hell-born fury, and revenge. Heaven hath not mercy to forgive such execrable guilt. Who gave thee power, abandoned ruffian? Over the lives of those whom God hath stationed as thy fellows of probation, over those whom he had sent to comfort and assist thee, to sweeten all thy cares, and smooth the rough uneven paths of life. Oh! I am doomed to never-ceasing horror and remorse. If misery can atone for such enormous guilt, I have felt it in the extreme. Like an undying vulture it preys upon my heart, to sorrow I am wedded, I hug that teeming consort to my soul, never, ah! Never shall we part, for soon as my fame shall shine unclouded by the charge of treason that now hangs over it, I will devote myself to penitence and woe. A cold, damp pavement shall be my bed, my raiment shall be sackcloth, the field shall furnish herbage for my food, the stream shall quench my thirst, the minutes shall be numbered by my groans, the night be privy to my strains of sorrow, till heaven, in pity to my sufferings, release me from the penance I endure. Perhaps the saints whom I have murdered will intercede for my remission. Such was the exercise of grief, in which the hapless Castilian consumed the night. He had not yet consigned himself to rest, when Rinaldo entering his chamber, displayed such a gleam of wildness and rapture on his countenance, as overwhelmed him with amazement, for, till that moment, he had never seen his visage unobscured with woe. "Pardon this abrupt intrusion, my friend," cried Melville, "I could no longer withhold from your participation, the great, the unexpected turn, which hath this night dispelled all my sorrows, and restored me to the fruition of ineffable joy. Monimia lives, the fair, the tender, the virtuous Monimia lives, and smiles upon my vows. This night I retrieved her from the grave. I held her in these arms, I pressed her warm delicious lips to mine. Oh, I am giddy with intolerable pleasure." Don Diego was confounded at this declaration, which he considered as the effects of a disordered brain. He never doubted that Rinaldo's grief had at length overpowered his reason, and that his words were the effects of mere frenzy. While he mused on this melancholy subject, the Count composed his features, and, in a succinct and well-connected detail, explained the whole mystery of his happiness, to the inexpressible astonishment of the Spaniard, who shed tears of satisfaction, and straining the Hungarian to his breast, "O my son," said he, "you see what recompense heaven hath in store for those who pursue the paths of real virtue, those paths from which I myself have been fatally misled by a faithless vapor, which hath seduced my steps, and left me darkling in the abyss of wretchedness. Such as you describe this happy fair, was once my Seraphina, rich in every grace of mind and body which nature could bestow. Had it pleased heaven to bless her with a lover like Rinaldo. But no more, the irrevocable shaft is fled. I will not taint your enjoyment with my unavailing sighs." Melville assured this disconsolate father, that no pleasure, no avocation should ever so entirely engross his mind, but that he should still find an hour for sympathy and friendship. He communicated the invitation of Madame Clement, and insisted upon his compliance, that he might have an opportunity of seeing and approving the object of his passion. "I can refuse nothing to the request of Count de Melville," replied the Spaniard, "and it were ungrateful in me to decline the honor you propose. I own myself inflamed with a desire of beholding a young lady, whose perfections I have seen reflected in your sorrow. My curiosity is, moreover, interested on account of that humane gentlewoman, whose uncommon generosity sheltered such virtue in distress, but my disposition is infectious, and will, I am afraid, hang like a damp upon the general festivity of your friends." Melville would take no denial, and having obtained his consent, repaired to the house of Joshua, whose countenance seemed to unbend gradually into a total expression of joy and surprise, as he learned the circumstances of this amazing event. He faithfully promised to attend the Count at the appointed hour, and, in the meantime, earnestly exhorted him to take some repose, in order to quiet the agitation of his spirits, which must have been violently hurried on this occasion. The advice was salutary, and Rinaldo resolved to follow it. He returned to his lodgings, and laid himself down, but, notwithstanding the fatigue he had undergone, sleep refused to visit his eyelids, all his faculties being kept in motion by the ideas that crowded so fast upon his imagination. Nevertheless, though his mind continued in agitation, his body was refreshed, and he arose in the forenoon with more serenity and vigor than he had enjoyed for many months. Every moment his heart throbbed with new rapture. When he found himself on the brink of possessing all that his soul held dear and amiable, he put on his gayest looks and apparel, insisted upon the Castilians doing the same honor to the occasion, and the alteration of dress produced such an advantageous change in the appearance of Don Diego, that when Joshua arrived at the appointed hour, he could scarce recognize his features, and complimented him very politely on the improvement of his looks. True it is, the Spaniard was a personage of a very prepossessing mien and noble deportment, and had not grief, by increasing his native gravity, in some measure discomposed the symmetry of his countenance, he would have passed for a man of a very amiable and engaging physiognomy. They set out in the Jew's coach for the house of Madame Clement, and were ushered into an apartment, where they found the clergyman and physician with that lady, to whom Don Diego and the Hebrew were by Melville introduced. Before they had seated themselves, Rinaldo inquired about the health of Monimia, and was directed to the next room by Madame Clement, who permitted him to go thither, and conduct her to the company. He was not slow of availing himself of this permission. He disappeared in an instant, and, during his short absence, Don Diego was strangely disturbed. The blood flushed and forsook his cheeks by turns, a cold vapor seemed to shiver through his nerves, and at his breast he felt uncommon palpitation. Madame Clement observed his discomposure, and kindly inquired into the cause, when he replied, "I have such an interest in what concerns the Count de Melville, and my imagination is so much prepossessed with the perfections of Monimia, that I am, as it were, agonized with expectation, yet never did my curiosity before raise such tumults as those that now agitate my bosom." He had scarce pronounced these words, when the door, reopening, Rinaldo led in this mirror of elegance and beauty, at sight of whom the Israelite's countenance was distorted into a stare of admiration. But if such was the astonishment of Joshua, what were the emotions of the Castilian, when, in the beauteous orphan, he beheld the individual features of his long-lost Serafina. His feelings are not to be described. The fond parent, whose affection shoots even to a sense of pain, feels not half such transport, when he unexpectedly retrieves a darling child from the engulfing billows or devouring flame. The hope of Zealous had been totally extinguished. His heart had been incessantly torn with anguish and remorse, upbraiding him as the murderer of Serafina. His, therefore, were the additional transports of a father disburdened of the guilt of such enormous homicide. His nerves were too much overpowered by this sudden recognition, to manifest the sensation of his soul by external signs. He started not, nor did he lift an hand in token of surprise. He moved not from the spot on which he stood, but, riveting his eyes to those of the lovely phantom, remained without motion, until she, approaching with her lover, fell at his feet and clasping his knees, exclaimed, "May I yet call you father?" This powerful shock aroused his faculties, a cold sweat bedewed his forehead, his knees began to totter, he dropped upon the floor, and throwing his arms around her, cried, "O nature! O Serafina! Merciful Providence! Thy ways are past finding out." So saying, he fell upon her neck, and wept aloud. The tears of sympathetic joy trickled down her snowy bosom, that heaved with rapture inexpressible. Rinaldo's eyes poured forth the briny stream. The cheeks of Madame Clement were not dry in this conjuncture. She kneeled by Serafina, kissed her with all the eagerness of maternal affection, and with uplifted hands adored the power that preordained this blessed event. The clergyman and doctor intimately shared the general transport, and as for Joshua, the drops of true benevolence flowed from his eyes, like the oil on Aaron's beard, while he skipped about the room in an awkward ecstasy, and in a voice resembling the hoarse notes of the long-eared tribe, cried, "O Father Abraham!" Such a moving scene hath not been acted since Joseph disclosed himself unto his brethren in Egypt. Don Diego, having found utterance to his passion, proceeded in this strain, "O my dear child! To find thee thus again, after our last unhappy parting, is wonderful. Miraculous. Blessed be the all-good, my conscience. I am not then the dire assassin, who sacrificed his wife and daughter to an infernal motive, falsely titled honor. Though I am more and more involved in a mystery, which I long to hear explained." "That shall be my task," cried Rinaldo, "but first permit me to implore your sanction to my passion for the incomparable Serafina. You already know our mutual sentiments, and though I own the possession of such inestimable worth and beauty would be a recompense that infinitely transcends the merit I can plead, yet, as it hath been my good fortune to inspire her with a mutual flame, I hope to reap from your indulgence here, what I could not expect from my own desert, and we present ourselves, in hope of your paternal assent and benediction." "Were she more fair and good and gentle than she is," answered the Castilian, "and to my partial observation not e'er appeared on earth more beauteous and engaging, I would approve your title to her heart and recommend you to her smiles, with all a father's influence and power. Yes, my daughter. My joy on this occasion is infinitely augmented by the knowledge of those tender ties of love that bind thee to this amiable youth, a youth to whose uncommon courage and generosity I owe my life and my subsistence, together with the inexpressible delight that now revels in my bosom. Enjoy, my children, the happy fruits of your reciprocal attachment. May Heaven, which hath graciously conducted you through a labyrinth of perplexity and woe, to this transporting view of blissful days, indulge you with that uninterrupted stream of pure felicity, which is the hope, and ought to be the boon of virtue, such as yours." So saying, he joined their hands, and embraced them with the most cordial love and satisfaction, which diffused itself to every individual of the company, who fervently invoked the Almighty Power, in behalf of this enraptured pair. The tumult of these emotions having a little subsided, and the Castilian being seated betwixt Rinaldo and his beauteous bride, he politely bespoke the indulgence of Madame Clement, begging she would permit him to demand the performance of the Count's promise, that he might be forthwith made acquainted with those circumstances of his own fate which he was so impatient to learn. The lady having assured him, that she and all the company would take pleasure in hearing the recapitulation, the Spaniard, addressing himself to Melville, "In the name of heaven," said he, "how could you supplant that rival, who fell a sacrifice to my resentment, after he had bewitched the heart of Seraphina? For, sure, the affection he had kindled in her breast must have long survived his death." "That rival," replied the Count, "who incurred your displeasure, was no other than Rinaldo." With these words, he applied to one eye a patch of black silk provided for the purpose, and turning his face towards Don Diego, that gentleman started with astonishment, crying, "Good heaven! The very countenance of Orlando, whom I slew! This is still more amazing." Chapter 65, a retrospective link, necessary for the concatenation of these memoirs. "Indulge me with a patient hearing," proceeded the Hungarian, "and all these riddles soon will be explained. Inflamed with the desire of seeing foreign countries, I disobeyed the will of an indulgent father, from whose house, withdrawing privately, I set out for Italy, in disguise, by the way of Tyrol, visited Venice, Rome, Florence, and, embarking at Naples, in an English ship, arrived at St. Lucar, from whence I repaired to Seville. There, in a few days, was my curiosity engaged by the fame of the fair Seraphina, who was justly deemed the most accomplished beauty in that part of Spain. Nay, blush not, gentle creature. For by my hopes of heaven, thy charms were even injured by the cold applause of that report. Nevertheless, I was warmly interested by the uncommon character, and eagerly longed to see this pattern of perfection. As Don Diego did not train her up in that restraint to which the Spanish ladies are subjected, I soon found an opportunity of seeing her at church, and no person here present will, I presume, doubt but that I was instantly captivated by her beauty and deportment. Had I thought that Don Diego's favor was unengaged, perhaps I should have followed the dictates of vanity and inexperience, and presented myself in my own character, among the crowd of her professed admirers. I knew her father had been an officer of distinguished rank and reputation, and did not doubt that he would have regarded a young soldier of unexceptionable pedigree, and, I will even add, of untainted fame. Nor did I suppose my own father could have objected against such an advantageous match, but, by dint of industrious inquiry, I learned that the divine Seraphina was already betrothed to Don Manuel de Mendoza, and this information overwhelmed me with despair. After having revolved 1,000 projects for retarding and preventing that detested union, I resolved to avail myself of my talent for drawing, and professed myself a master of that science, in hope of being employed by the father of Seraphina, who, I knew, let slip no opportunity of improving his daughter's education. Accordingly I had the good fortune to attract his notice, was invited to his house, honored with his approbation, and furnished with unrestricted opportunities of conversing with the dear object of my love. The passion which her beauty had kindled was by the perfections of her mind inflamed to such a degree of transport, as could not be concealed from her penetration. She chanced to relish my conversation, I gradually acquired her friendship, pity was the next passion that she entertained in my favor. I then ventured to disclose myself, and the dear charmer did not disapprove of my presumption. She and her mother had been perplexed with some religious scruples, concerning which they appealed to my opinion, and I was happy enough to set their minds at ease. This sort of intercourse naturally created a mutual confidence among us, and, in a word, I was blessed with the daughter's love and mother's approbation. Don Diego will pardon these clandestine measures, which we took, from a full persuasion that it was impossible to render him propitious to the views in which our hearts and hands were so deeply interested. I did not then know how little he was addicted to superstition. Without entering into a detail of the schemes we projected to delay the happiness of Mendoza, I shall only observe, that, knowing the fatal day was at length unalterably fixed, we determined to elude the purpose of Don Diego by flight, and everything was actually prepared for our escape. When the hour of appointment arrived, I repaired to the place at which I had proposed to enter the house, and stumbled, in the dark, over the body of a man still warm and bleeding. Alarmed at this occurrence, I darted myself through the window, and rushing to the apartment of the ladies, immortal powers, beheld the peerless Seraphina, and her virtuous mother, stretched on a couch, and, in all appearance, deprived of life. The company will easily conceive what agonies I felt at such a spectacle. I ran towards the spot in a transport of horror. I clasped my lovely mistress in my arms, and, finding her still breathing, endeavored, but in vain, to wake her from the trance. Antonia was overwhelmed with the same lethargic power. My fancy was immediately struck with the apprehension of their being poisoned. Regardless of my own situation, I alarmed the family, called for assistance, and requested the servants to summon Don Diego to the dismal scene. I was informed that their master had rode forth in manifest confusion, and while I pondered on this surprising excursion, an apothecary in the neighborhood entered the chamber, and having examined the pulses of the ladies, declared that their lives were in no danger, and advised that they should be undressed, and conveyed to bed. While their women were busied in this employment, I went into the courtyard, attended by some of the servants with lights, in order to view the body of the man which I had found at my arrival. His apparel was mean, his countenance ferocious, a long spado was buckled to his thigh, and, in his belt, were stuck a brace of loaded pistols, so that we concluded he was some thief, who had waited for an opportunity, and seeing the casement open, intended to rob the house, but was prevented, and slain by Don Diego himself, whose retreat, however, did not a little confound our conjecture. For my own part, I remained all night in the house, tortured with fear, vexation, and suspense. My hope was altogether disappointed by this unhappy accident, and I shuddered at the prospect of losing Serafina forever, either by this mysterious malady, or by her marriage with Mendoza, which I now despaired of being able to defeat. The majordomo, having waited several hours for his lord's return, without seeing him appear, thought proper to dispatch a messenger to Don Manuel, with an account of what had happened, and that nobleman arriving in the morning, took possession of the house. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Serafina began to stir, and, at 5, she and her mother were perfectly awake. They no sooner recovered the use of reflection, than they gave signs of equal sorrow and amazement, and earnestly called for Isabella, who was privy to our design, and who, after a very minute inquiry, was found in a lone and solitary chamber, where she had been confined. Such was the confusion of the house, that no person ever dreamed of asking how I entered, each domestic, in all probability, supposing I had been introduced by his fellow, so that I tarried unquestioned, on pretence of concern for the distress of a family in which I had been so generously entertained, and, by Isabella, sent my respects and duty to her ladies. She was, therefore, not a little surprised, when, after every other servant had withdrawn, she heard the lovely Serafina exclaim, with all the violence of grief, "Ah! Isabella, Orlando is no more." But their astonishment was still greater, when she assured them of my being alive, and in the house. They recounted to her the adventure of last night, which she explained, by informing them of the letters which Don Diego had intercepted. And they immediately concluded, that he had, in the precipitation of his wrath, killed, by mistake, the person who was found dead in the courtyard. This conjecture alarmed them on my account. They, by the medium of Isabella, conjured me to leave the house, lest Don Diego should return, and accomplish his resentment, and I was persuaded to withdraw, after I had settled the channel of a correspondence with the confidant. Being now obliged to alter our measures, because our former intention was discovered by Don Diego, I secured a retreat for Serafina and her mother, at the house of the English consul in Seville, who was my particular friend, and, next day, understanding from Isabella that her lord had not yet reappeared, and that Don Manuel was very urgent in his addresses, we concerted an assignation in the garden, and that same evening I was fortunate enough to convey my prize to the asylum I had prepared for their reception. Inexpressible was the rage of Mendoza, when he heard of their elopement. He raved like one deprived of reason, swore he would put all the servants of the family to the rack, and, in consequence of the intelligence he obtained by threats and promises, set on foot a very strict inquiry, in order to apprehend the fugitives and Orlando, who had by some means or other incurred his suspicion. We eluded his search by the vigilance and caution of our kind host, and, while we remained in concealment, were extremely astonished to hear that the unfortunate Don Diego was proclaimed a traitor, and a price set upon his head. This information overwhelmed us all with the utmost affliction. Antonia lamented, without ceasing, the disgrace of her beloved lord, from whom she never would have withdrawn herself, but with the lively hope of a reconciliation, after the first transports of his ire should have subsided, and the real character of Orlando should have appeared. It was not long before we had reason to believe that Mendoza was the accuser of Don Diego. Nay, start not, Señor, Manuel was actually that traitor. This was the turn of his revenge. When he found himself disappointed in the hope of possessing the incomparable Serafina, he took a base advantage of your absence and retreat. He posted to Madrid, impeached you to the Secretary of State of having maintained a criminal correspondence with the enemies of Spain, included me in his accusation, as a spy for the House of Austria, and framed such a plausible tale, from the circumstances of your distress, that Don Diego was outlawed, and Mendoza gratified with a grant of his estate. These melancholy incidents made a deep impression upon the mind of the virtuous Antonia, who, waiving every other consideration, would have personally appeared for the vindication of her husband's honor, had not we dissuaded her from such a rash undertaking, by demonstrating her inability to contend with such a powerful antagonist, and representing that her appearance would be infallibly attended with the ruin of Serafina, who would certainly fall into the hands of the villain to whom she had been contracted. We exhorted her to wait patiently for some happy revolution of fortune, and encouraged her with the hope of Don Diego's exerting himself effectually in his own defense. Meanwhile our worthy landlord was suddenly cut off by death, and his widow being resolved to retire into her own country, we secretly embarked in the same ship, and arrived in England about 18 months ago. Antonia still continued to pine over the ruin of her house. As she could hear no tidings of Don Diego, she concluded he was dead, and mourned with unabating sorrow. In vain I assured her, that, soon as my own affairs should be adjusted, I would exert my whole endeavors to find and succor him. She could not imagine that a man of his spirit and disposition would live so long in obscurity. And her affliction derived new force from the death of the consul's widow, with whom she had lived in the most unbounded intimacy and friendship. From that day, her health evidently declined. She foresaw her dissolution, and comforted herself with the hope of seeing her husband and her friend in a place where no treachery is felt, and no sorrow is known. Confident of my integrity, and the purity of my love, she, in the most pathetic terms, recommended Serafina to my care. Ha! Weepest thou, fair excellence, at the remembrance of that tender scene, when the good Antonia, on the bed of death, joined thy soft hand to mine, and said, Rinaldo, I bequeath this orphan to your love. It is a sacred pledge, which, if you cherish with due honor and regard, internal peace and happiness will ever smile within your bosom, but if you treat it with indifference, dishonor, or neglect, just heaven will punish your breach of trust with everlasting disappointments and disquiet. Señor Don Diego, I see you are moved, and therefore will not dwell on such distressful circumstances. The excellent Antonia exchanged this life for a more happy state, and so exquisite was the sorrow of the tender-hearted Serafina, as to torture me with the apprehension that she would not long survive her pious mother. How I obeyed the injunctions of that departing saint, Monimia, for that name she now assumed, can testify, until that artful serpent Fathom glided into our mutual confidence, abused our ears, poisoned our unsuspected faith, and effected that fatal breach, productive of all the misery and vexation which we have suffered, and which is now so happily expelled. Heaven, said the Castilian, hath visited me for the sins and errors of my youth, yet, such mercy hath been mingled with its chastisements, I dare not murmur or repine. The tears of penitence and sorrow shall water my Antonia's grave. As for Mendoza, I rejoice at his treachery, by which the obligation of my promise is cancelled, and my honor fully acquitted. He shall not triumph in his guilt. My services, my character, and innocence shall soon confront his perfidy, and, I hope, defeat his interest. The king is just and gracious, nor is my family and name unknown. Here the Jew interposing, presented to him a letter from a person of consequence at Madrid, whom Joshua had interested in the cause of Don Diego. That nobleman had already found means to represent the case of Zealous to his majesty, who had actually ordered Don Manuel to be confined, until the injured person should appear to justify himself, and prosecute his accuser according to the terms of law. At the same time Don Diego was summoned to present himself before the king within a limited time, to answer to the charge which Mendoza had brought against him. The Spaniard's heart overflowed with gratitude and joy. When he read this intimation, he embraced the Jew, who, before Zealous could give utterance to his thoughts, told him that the Spanish ambassador at London, having been prepossessed in his favor, craved the honor of seeing Don Diego, and that he, Joshua, was ready to conduct him to the house. "Then is my heart at rest," cried the Castilian, "the house of Zealous once more shall lift up its head. I shall again revisit my native country with honor, and abase the villain who hath soiled my fame. O my children! This day is replete with such joy and satisfaction, as I did not think had been in the power of heaven to grant, without the interposition of a miracle. To you, Rinaldo, to you illustrious lady, and to these worthy gentlemen, am I indebted for the restoration of that for which alone I wish to live, and when my heart ceases to retain the obligation, may I forfeit the name of a Castilian, and scorn and dishonor be my portion. Perhaps all Europe could not produce another company so happy as that which now sat down to dinner in the house of Madame Clement, whose own benevolent heart was peculiarly adapted for such enjoyment. The lovers feasted their eyes more than their appetite, by a tender intercourse of glances, which needed not the slow interpretation of speech, while the Spaniard regarded them alternately with looks of wonder and paternal joy, and every individual surveyed the all-deserving pair with admiration and esteem. Serafina, taking the advantage of this general satisfaction, when the heart, softened into complacency, deposits every violent thought, "I must now," said she, "try my interest with Rinaldo. The good company shall bear witness to my triumph or repulse. I do not ask you to forgive, but to withhold your vengeance from the wretched Fathom. His fraud, ingratitude, and villainy are, I believe, unrivaled, yet his base designs have been defeated, and heaven perhaps hath made him the involuntary instrument for bringing our constancy and virtue to the test. Besides, his perfidy is already punished with the last degree of human misery and disgrace. The doctor, who has traced him in all his conduct and vicissitudes of fortune, will draw a picture of his present wretchedness, which, I doubt not, will move your compassion, as it hath already excited mine." The generous hostess was ready to enforce this charitable proposal with all her eloquence, when Melville, with a look that well expressed his magnanimity of love, replied, "Such a boon becomes the gentle Serafina. Oh! Every moment furnishes me with fresh matter to admire the virtues of thy soul. If thou, whose tender heart hath been so rent with misery and anguish, canst intercede for thy tormentor, who now suffers in his turn, shall I refuse to pardon the miserable wretch? No, let me glory in imitating the great example, and solicit Don Diego in behalf of the same miscreant whose perfidious barbarity cost him such intolerable woe." "Enough," cried the Castilian, "I have disclaimed the vindictive principles of a Spaniard, and leave the miserable object to the sting of his own conscience, which, soon or late, will not fail to avenge the wrongs we have sustained from his deceit." Chapter 66. The history draws near a period. Universal was the applause which they acquired by this noble sacrifice of their resentment. The afternoon was spent in the utmost harmony and good humor, and at the earnest solicitation of Rinaldo, whose fancy still harbored the apprehensions of another separation, Don Diego consented that the indissoluble knot should be tied between that young gentleman and Serafina in 2 days, and the place appointed for the ceremony was the very church where they had been restored to the arms of each other. The lovely bride, with a silent blush that set her lover's heart on fire, submitted to this determination, in consequence of which the company was bespoke for that auspicious hour, and the evening being pretty far advanced, they took leave of the ladies, and retired to their respective homes, Don Diego and his future son-in-law being reconducted to their lodgings, in the coach of the Jew, who, taking an opportunity of being alone with Melville, observed that it would be necessary on this occasion to supply the Castilian with a sum of money, in order to support his dignity and independence, in furnishing Serafina with everything suitable to her rank and merit, and that he would willingly accommodate him, provided he knew how to propose it so as to give no offense to his punctilious disposition. Rinaldo, thanking him for this generous anticipation, advised him to solicit the Spaniard's correspondence in the way of business, and to put the whole on the footing of his own interest, by which means Don Diego's delicacy could sustain no affront. Fraught with this instruction, the Israelite desired a private audience of the Castilian, in which, after an apology for the freedom of his demand, "Señor Don Diego," said he, "as your fortune hath been so long embezzled by your adversary in Spain, and your correspondence with that country entirely cut off, it is not to be supposed that your finances are at present in such a condition as to maintain the splendor of your family. Count de Melville's whole fortune is at your command, and had not he been afraid of giving umbrage to the peculiar delicacy of your sentiments, he would have pressed you to use it for your convenience. For my own part, over and above the inclination I have to serve Don Diego, I consult my own private advantage in desiring you to accept my service on this occasion. Money is the chief commodity in which I deal, and, if you honor me with your commands, I shall be a gainer by my obedience." Don Diego replied, with a smile that denoted how well he understood the meaning of this address, "Surely, Señor, I am bound by the strongest ties to exert my utmost endeavors for your advantage, and I pray God this your proposal may have that issue. I am well acquainted with the Count's generosity and refined notions of honor, and too much obliged by him already, to hesitate with punctilious reserve in accepting his future assistance. Nevertheless, since you have contrived a scheme for removing all scruples of that sort, I shall execute it with pleasure, and, in the form of business, you shall have all the security I can give for what shall be necessary to answer my present occasions." The preliminaries being thus settled, Joshua advanced for his use £1,000, for which he would take neither bond, note, nor receipt, desiring only that the Castilian would mark it in his own pocketbook, that the debt might appear, in case any accident should befall the borrower. Although the Spaniard had been accustomed to the uncommon generosity of Melville, he could not help wondering at this nobleness of behavior, so little to be expected from any merchant, much less from a Jewish broker. While this affair was on the anvil, Rinaldo, who could no longer withhold the communication of his happiness from his sister and relations in Germany, took up the pen, and, in a letter to his brother-in-law, recounted all the circumstances of the surprising turn of fate which he had experienced since his arrival in England. He likewise related the story of Don Diego, informed them of the day appointed for his nuptials, and entreated the Major to make a journey to London with his wife, or, if that should be impracticable, to come as far as Brussels, where they should be met by him and his Seraphina. There was now but one day between him and the accomplishment of his dearest wish, and that was spent in procuring a license, and adjusting the preparations for the grand festival. Don Diego in the forenoon visited Madame Clement, to whom he repeated his warm acknowledgments of her bounty and maternal affection to his daughter, and presented to Seraphina bank notes to the amount of £500, to defray the necessary expense for her wedding ornaments. All the previous steps being taken for the solemnization of this interesting event, and the hour of appointment arrived, the bridegroom, accompanied by his father-in-law, hastened to the place of rendezvous, which was the vestry room of the church we have already described, where they were received by the good clergyman in his canonicals, and here they had not waited many minutes, when they were joined by Madame Clement and the amiable bride, escorted by the friendly physician, who had all along borne such a share in their concerns. Seraphina was dressed in a sack of white satin, and the ornaments of her head were adjusted in the Spanish fashion, which gave a peculiar air to her appearance, and an additional spirit to those attractions which engaged the heart of each beholder. There was nothing remarkable in the habit of Rinaldo, who had copied the plainness and elegance of his mistress, but, when she entered the place, his features were animated with a double proportion of vivacity, and their eyes meeting, seemed to kindle a blaze which diffused warmth and joy through the countenances of all present. After a short pause, her father led her to the altar, and gave her away to the transported Rinaldo, before the priest who performed the ceremony, and bestowed the nuptial benediction on this enraptured pair. The sanction of the church being thus obtained, they withdrew into the vestry, where Melville sealed his title on her rosy lips, and presented his wife to the company, who embraced her in their turns, with fervent wishes for their mutual happiness. Though the scene of this transaction was remote from any inhabited neighborhood, the church was surrounded by a crowd of people, who, with uncommon demonstration of surprise and admiration, petitioned heaven to bless so fair a couple. Such indeed was their eagerness to see them, that some lives were endangered by the pressure of the crowd, which attended them with loud acclamations to the coach, after the bridegroom had deposited in the hands of the minister £100 for the benefit of the poor of that parish, and thrown several handfuls of money among the multitude. Serafina re-embarked in Madame Clement's convenience, with that good lady and Don Diego, while Rinaldo, with the clergyman and doctor, followed in Joshua's coach, to a pleasant country house upon the Thames, at a distance of a few miles from London. This the Jew had borrowed from the owner for a few days, and there they were received by that honest Hebrew, who had provided a very elegant entertainment for the occasion. He had also bespoke a small but excellent band of music, which regaled their ears while they sat at dinner, and the afternoon being calm and serene, he prevailed on them to take the air on the river, in a barge which he had prepared for the purpose. But, notwithstanding this diversity of amusement, Rinaldo would have found it the longest day he had ever passed, had not his imagination been diverted by an incident which employed his attention during the remaining part of the evening. They had drunk tea, and engaged in a party at whist, when they were surprised with a noise of contention from a public house, that fronted the windows of the apartment in which they sat. Alarmed at this uproar, they forsook their cards, and, throwing up the casement, beheld a hearse surrounded by 4 men on horseback, who had stopped the carriage, and violently pulled the driver from his seat. This uncommon arrest had engaged the curiosity of the publican's family, who stood at the door to observe the consequence, when all of a sudden appeared a person in canonicals, well mounted, who, riding up to those who maltreated the driver, bestowed upon one of them such a blow with the butt end of his whip, as laid him sprawling on the ground, and, springing from his saddle upon the box, took the reins into his own hand, swearing with great vehemence that he would murder every man who should attempt to obstruct the hearse. The good priest who had married Rinaldo was not a little scandalized at this ferocious behavior in a clergyman, and could not help saying aloud, he was a disgrace to the cloth, when the horseman, looking up to the window, replied, "Sir, may I be D.N.D., if any man in England has a greater respect for the cloth than I have, but at present I am quite distracted." So saying, he whipped up the horses, and had actually disentangled the hearse from those who surrounded it, when he was opposed by another troop, one of whom alighted with great expedition, and cut the harness so as that he could not possibly proceed. Finding himself thus driven to bay, he leaped upon the ground, and exercised his weapon with such amazing strength and agility, that several of his antagonists were left motionless on the field, before he was overpowered and disarmed by dint of numbers, who assailed him on all sides. The mad parson being thus taken prisoner, an elderly person, of a very prepossessing appearance, went up to the hearse, and, unbolting the door, a young lady sprung out, and shrieking, ran directly to the public house, to the infinite astonishment and affright of the whole family, who believed it was the spirit of the deceased person, whose body lay in the carriage. Rinaldo, who was with difficulty restrained from interposing in behalf of the clergyman against such odds, no sooner perceived this apparition, than, supposing her to be some distressed damsel, his quixotism awoke, he descended in an instant, and rushed into the house, among those that pursued the fair phantom. Don Diego and the physician took the same road, while the real clergyman and Joshua tarried with the ladies, who were, by this time, very much interested in the event. Melville found the young lady in the hands of the old gentleman, who had released her from the hearse, and who now bitterly upbraided her for her folly and disobedience, while she protested with great vivacity, that whatever she might suffer from his severity, she would never submit to the hateful match he had proposed, nor break the promise she had already made to the gentleman who now attempted to rescue her from the tyranny of a cruel father. This declaration was followed by a plentiful shower of tears, which the father could not behold with unmoistened eyes, although he reviled her with marks of uncommon displeasure, and turning to the Count, "I appeal to you, sir," said he, "whether I have not reason to curse the undutiful obstinacy of that pert baggage, and renounce her for ever as an alien to my blood. She has, for some months, been solicited in marriage by an honest citizen, a £30,000 man, and instead of listening to such an advantageous proposal, she hath bestowed her heart upon a young fellow not worth a groat. Ah! You degenerate hussy, this comes of your plays and romances. If thy mother were not a woman of an unexceptionable life and conversation, I should verily believe thou art no child of mine. Run away with a beggar. For shame. I suppose, replied Rinaldo, the person to whom your daughter's affection inclines, is that clergyman who exerted himself so manfully at the door. Clergyman, cried the other, ad. He has more of the devil than the church about him. A ruffian. He has, for aught I know, murdered the worthy gentleman whom I intended for my son-in-law, and the rogue, if I had not kept out of his way, would, I suppose, have served me with the same sauce. Me, who have been his master for many years, and had resolved to make a man of him. Sir, he was my own clerk, and this is the return I have met with from the serpent which I cherished in my bosom. Here he was interrupted by the arrival of the citizen for whom he had expressed such concern. That gentleman had received a contusion upon one eye, by which the sight was altogether obstructed, so that he concluded he should never retrieve the use of that organ, and with great clamour took all the spectators to witness the injury he had sustained. He entered the room with manifest perturbation, demanded satisfaction of the father, and peremptorily declared it should not be a lost eye to him if there was law in England. This unseasonable demand, and the boisterous manner in which it was made, did not at all suit the present humour of the old gentleman, who told him peevishly he owed him no eye, and bade him go and ask reparation of the person who had done him wrong. The young lady, snatching this favourable occasion, earnestly entreated Melville and his company to intercede with her father in behalf of her lover. She assured them, was a young gentleman of a good family, and uncommon merit, and in compliance with her request they invited him and his daughter to the house in which they lodged, where they would be disencumbered of the crowd which this dispute had gathered together, and more at leisure to consult about the measures necessary to be taken. The old gentleman thanked them for their courtesy, which he did not think proper to refuse, and while he led, or rather hauled Mademoiselle over the way, under the auspices of the Castilian, Rinaldo set the lover at liberty, made him a tender of his good offices, and advised him to wait at the public house for an happy issue of their negotiation. The pseudo-parson was very much affected by this generous proffer, for which he made suitable acknowledgments, and protested before God he would die 1,000 deaths rather than part with his dear Charlotte. Her father no sooner entered the apartment, than he was known by Joshua to be a considerable trader in the city of London, and the merchant was glad to find himself among his acquaintance. He was so full of the story which had brought him thither, that he had scarce sat down when he began to complain of his hard fate, in having an only child who was so mean, stubborn, and contumacious, and every sentence was concluded with an apostrophe of reproaches to the delinquent. The Jew, having allowed him to ring out his alarm, condoled his misfortune, and gravely counselled the young lady to wean her affections from such an unworthy object, for he supposed her favourite was a man of no principle, or liberal endowments, otherwise her father would not exclaim so bitterly against her conduct. Charlotte, who wanted neither beauty nor understanding, assured him that her lover's character was, in all respects, unblemished, for the truth of which assertion she appealed to her papa, who owned, with reluctance, that the young man was a gentleman by birth, that he had served him with remarkable diligence and integrity, and that his accomplishments were far superior to his station in life. But then, said he, the fellow has not a shilling of his own, and would you have me give away my daughter to a beggar? God forbid, cried the Jew, I always understood you possessed an ample fortune, and am sorry to find it otherwise. Otherwise, cried the citizen, with some acrimony, take care what you say, sir, a merchant's credit is not to be tampered with. I beg your pardon, answered the Hebrew, I concluded that your circumstances were bad, because you objected to the poverty of the young man after you had owned he was possessed of every other qualification to make your daughter happy, for it is not to be imagined that you would thwart her inclinations, or seek to render an only child miserable on account of an obstacle which you yourself could easily remove. Let us suppose you can afford to give with your daughter £10,000, which would enable this young man to live with credit and reputation, and engage advantageously in trade, for which you say he is well qualified. The alternative then will be, whether you would rather see her in the arms of a deserving youth whom she loves, enjoying all the comforts of life with a moderate fortune, which it will always be in your own power to improve, or tied for life to a moneyed man whom she detests. Cursing her hard fate, and despising that superfluity of wealth, in spite of which she finds herself so truly wretched. The old gentleman seemed to be startled at this observation, which was reinforced by Rinaldo's saying, that he would, moreover, enjoy the unutterable pleasure of giving happiness to a worthy man, whose gratitude would co-operate with his love, in approving himself a dutiful son, as well as an affectionate husband. He then represented the family disquiets and dismal tragedies produced from such mercenary and compulsive matches, and, in conclusion related the story of Don Diego and his daughter, which when the merchant heard, he started up with marks of terror in his countenance, and, throwing up the casement, called upon Valentine with great vociferation. This was the name of his daughter's admirer, who no sooner heard the summons than he flew to the spot from whence it came, and the merchant, without any further preamble, seizing his hand, joined it with that of Charlotte, saying, with great trepidation, "Here, take her, in the name of God, and thank this honorable company for your good fortune." The lovers were transported with exquisite joy at this sudden determination in their favor. Valentine, having kissed the hand of his mistress with all the eagerness of rapture, and acknowledged the merchant's generosity, paid his respects to the ladies with a very polite address, and with demonstrations of uncommon gratitude and sensibility, thanked the gentleman, and the Count in particular, for their good offices, to which he attributed the happiness he now enjoyed. While Seraphina and Madame Clement caressed the amiable Charlotte, the rest of the company congratulated her admirer upon his choice and success, though the clergyman could not help reprehending him for profaning the sacerdotal habit. Valentine heartily asked pardon for having given such cause of offense, and hoped he should be forgiven, as it was a disguise which he thought absolutely necessary for the execution of a scheme upon which his happiness depended. He then, at the request of Rinaldo, unfolded the mystery of the hearse, by giving them to understand that Charlotte's father, having got inkling of their mutual passion, had dismissed his clerk, and conveyed his daughter to a country house in the neighborhood of London, in order to cut off their correspondence. Notwithstanding these precautions, they had found means to communicate with each other by letters, which were managed by a third person, and his rival being very importunate in his solicitations, they had concerted the expedient of the hearse, which he provided and conducted through a road contiguous to the end of the merchant's garden, where Charlotte, being apprised of the design, waited for its approach, and embarked in it without hesitation. Valentine thought himself sufficiently screened from discovery by his disguise, but he was unfortunately met by a servant of the family, who recollected his features, and immediately gave the alarm, upon which the father and his friends took horse, and pursued them by 2 different roads, until they were overtaken at this place. He had scarce finished this short relation, when his rival, bluntly entering the apartment, with an handkerchief tied round his eye, committed Valentine to the charge of a constable, who attended him, by a warrant from a justice of the peace in that neighborhood, and threatened to prosecute the merchant on an action of damages for the loss of an eye, which he said he had sustained in his service. The company endeavored to appease this citizen, by representing that his misfortune was no other than a common inflammation, nor was it owing to malice aforethought, but entirely to the precipitate passion of an incensed young man, who, by the by, acted in his own defense. At the same time the merchant promised to make any reasonable satisfaction, upon which the other demanded an obligation, importing that he would, in 10 days from the date, bestow upon him his daughter in marriage, with a portion of £15,000, or, in case of failure, pay him double the sum. The merchant, exasperated at this extravagant demand, told him flatly he had already disposed of his daughter to Valentine, who, he believed, was a much more deserving man, and that he was ready to wait upon the magistrate who had granted the warrant, in order to give bail for his future son-in-law. This was a mortifying declaration to the plaintiff, though he condoled himself with the hope of being a gainer by the loss of his eye, and now the pain was over would have been very sorry to find his sight retrieved. The old gentleman, Joshua, and Rinaldo accompanied the prisoner to the house of the justice, where he was immediately admitted to bail. Upon their return Valentine shifted his dress, and they supped together with great cordiality and mirth, maintained at the expense of the discarded lover. After supper Don Diego walked a minuet with Madame Clement, for whom, by this time, he had contracted an extraordinary degree of affection. Valentine had the honor to dance with the incomparable Seraphina, whose beauty and attractions dazzled the eyes of the newcomers, and struck her bashful partner with awe and confusion, and Melville presented his hand to the agreeable Charlotte, who performed so much to the satisfaction of her father, that he could not help expressing his joy and pride. He praised God for throwing him in the way of our company, and engaged the clergyman to unite the young couple, after having appointed a day for the ceremony, and invited all present to the wedding. The evening having been insensibly consumed in these avocations, and the night pretty far advanced, the ladies withdrew without ceremony, and the retreat of Seraphina filled Rinaldo's breast with tumult and emotion. His blood began to flow in impetuous tides, his heart to beat with redoubled vigor and velocity, while his eyes seemed to flash with more than human splendor. Now his imagination began to anticipate with the enthusiastic rage of an inspired Sibyl. He was instantaneously transported from the conversation, and every nerve was braced to such a degree of impatience, that human nature could not long endure the tension. He, therefore, having withstood the impulse about a quarter of an hour, at length gave way to his impetuosity, and, springing from his friends, found himself in a dark passage, at the farther end of which he perceived Madame Clement coming out of a chamber with a light, which, at sight of him, she set down, and vanished in a moment. This was the star that pointed to his paradise. He hailed the signal, entered the apartment, and, like a lion, rushing on his prey, approached the nuptial bed, where Seraphina, surrounded by all the graces of beauty, softness, sentiment, and truth, lay trembling as a victim at the altar, and strove to hide her blushes from his view. The door was shut, the light extinguished. He owned his lot was more than mortal man could claim. Here let me draw the decent veil that ought to shade the secret mysteries of Hymen. Away, unhallowed scoffers, who profane, with idle pleasantry or immodest hint, these holy rites, and leave those happy lovers to enjoy, in one another's arms, unutterable bliss, the well-earned palm of virtue and of constancy, which had undergone the most severe refinement. A more deserving pair night's curtain shrouds not in its dark extent. The thoughts of Rinaldo's felicity threw a damp on the spirits of Valentine, who saw the term of his probation protracted a few days longer, and could not help wishing in his heart that he had achieved the adventure which would have abridged his expectation, though at the expense of the old gentleman's displeasure. He filled a bumper to the health of the bride and bridegroom, and throwing up his eyes with marks of admiration, exclaimed, "How happy is the Count! Alas! 5 days longer must I rein my impatience. It is but reasonable, you rogue, that your betters should have the start of you," said the merchant, who did him justice in the glass, and counselled him to drown his impatience with good claret. The youth followed his advice, and it was late before the company retired to rest. These citizens, however, resolved to seize an opportunity of rallying the new married couple, according to custom, and with that view arose early in the morning, on the supposition of finding them still asleep, but they were not a little surprised, when they entered the breakfasting room, to see Rinaldo, and his amiable bedfellow, already dressed, and awaiting to do the honors of the house. The old gentleman would fain have cracked a joke upon their extraordinary dispatch, but he was so much overawed by the dignity and tamed by the sweetness of Seraphina's carriage, that he durst not give utterance to his conception, and Valentine stood silent and abashed, as in the presence of a superior being. After breakfast these gentlemen and Charlotte again expressed their sense of the obligations they owed to this happy family, repeated their invitation, and, taking leave, returned to London in a coach that was provided overnight. Our friends being thus left to themselves, Don Diego turned towards Melville. "Now," said he, "that I have yielded to the impatience of your love, as well as to the eagerness of my own desire to make you happy, I must beg leave to interrupt, for a little while, the stream of your mutual pleasure, and propose a melancholy excursion, which, however, will not be wholly void of enjoyment. I have too long delayed the performance of my duty at Antonia's grave. Let us spend the forenoon in that pious pilgrimage. I will drop a few tears to the memory of that excellent woman, and never afterwards shall my friends be troubled with my grief." The proposal being universally approved, they set out for the place, which had oft been visited by the gentle Seraphina, who conducted her father to a black marble stone, which Rinaldo had ordered to be laid over the grave, and, as he kneeled to kiss the monument, he perceived this plain inscription in the Spanish tongue: Antonia de Zelis primera en todo lo que es ser bueno, y sin segundo en todo lo que fue ser destacado, quedad con Dios. That is, Antonia de Zelis, unmatched in virtue, and unequaled in misfortune, adieu. O faithful record, cried the Castilian, smiting his breast, while his tears distilled upon the marble, thy goodness was the gift of heaven, but thy misfortunes were derived from the guilt of Don Diego, yet his sorrow shall expiate his offense, and his penitence find favor in the sight of heaven. Rest, rest, ill-fated virtue, eternal peace shall guard thy tomb, and angels minister to thy unspotted shade, nor shall thine ashes lie in dark obscurity. Here will I raise a monument, more suited to thy excellence and name. Serafina melted with filial tenderness, nor were the rest unmoved at this affecting scene, which Don Diego did not quit without reluctance.